to the Polgar Chess University. In this lesson, I'd like to share with you two games of Bobby Fischer's, and the topic of the day is to trade or not to trade, one of the most difficult choices throughout our games. Which pieces to trade, and when to trade them, and when to avoid the exchange of, let's say, a pair of queens or other pieces. This is the first example we're seeing that Bobby Fischer played against Oster in 1963. White has offered to trade queens on a4. Let's discuss this position for a moment. The material balance is even. Each side has completely the same number and same type of pieces. Therefore, typically, positions of such tend to be around even. Now, as of the strategical situation, it's quite clear that black is very strong on the dark squares, as black has a very powerful dark squared bishop on g7, while white does not have a dark squared bishop. Also, at the same time, the white bishop on f3 is not as active at all as its counterpart, because at the moment white has the two middle pawns on e4 and d5 blocking the white bishop's way, and chances are white will have one of his pieces sitting on e5, not allowing the white e4 pawn to advance, which means that the white bishop will continuously be restrictive in its mobility. Typically, when you have pressure on your opponent, you have various types of strategical advantages, and your king is not in any danger whatsoever, which is the case here, it's beneficial to keep the queens on the board. It's noticeable that by white not having a pawn on f2, the white king is more likely to be in danger than black's. Therefore, it's a better choice in this case not to trade queens. Bobby Fischer continued by retreating the queen all the way to d8 to protect his knight on d7. Also, by making this move, black pretty much gained a tempo because the white knight is still under attack. Obviously, black could not have captured that knight right away because the black queen was in danger. White continued by playing knight to b5, which is not a great choice, although white's position was pretty hopeless in any rate, because the b2 pawn was hanging. The problem here is more than just losing the b2 pawn. In fact, that would still give white counter chances. The best move here is to come back with the queen to b6. Now that the knight on d7 is not under attack, and black all of a sudden threatens with various things. Threatens to advance the c5 pawn and create a discovered check in certain cases, but even more importantly, threatens to trap the white knight that at the moment, as you can see, has no escape square. White has tried to advance the pawn further, so the knight will have an escape square. Would black choose to play a6 right now? But black can do that better by a couple of important intermediate moves. Fischer continued by giving an intermediate check, c4. White doesn't have much of a choice but to move out of the check, and then play knight c5, another important move, attacking the white queen. And now the white queen needs to move to a square that will still protect the knight on b5, and the only choice to accomplish that is to capture the pawn on b4, And now Black can use the pin by playing a6. White's position is quite hopeless already, but let me show you anyway the last few moves of the game. White played rook to d5, counter-attacking, but the knight just moves to d3, attacking the white queen. Queen captured pawn and knight f2. Well, as we know, if the king would now move to g1, force checkmate in 3 by smothered mate, I guess you can figure it out. Knight h3, and now the brilliant queen g1. White did not allow this, but decided to give up the rook. But sadly for White, now White will be forced to lose the knight as well because of the threat of a back rank checkmate with queen e1. The rook returned to d1, and then simply pawn takes knight, queen took the pawn, and White resigned in just a couple of more moves. Let's move on to our second example, where it's another game of Bobby Fischer's where he had the black pieces against the late American Grandmaster Edmar Madness. And this was a very critical moment of the game where Fischer just played rook d7 attacking the queen. And here White has to make a very critical decision what to do. Obviously, the most natural move is to retreat the queen to g5, and that's what White played in the game. In this case, that meant missing the winning opportunities. What White should have done here is actually to look for creative ways or alternatives that may be better than the simple retreat. And in this case, White actually had two good choices. One of them is to play knight to c5 and sacrificing the queen. If right now Black would capture the knight with the rook, of course, immediate back rank checkmate would follow on e8. But what happens if Black captures the queen instead? Well, then White recaptures, threatening rook d8 and then followed by back rank checkmate. The only thing Black can do here is to give up his rook to avoid the back rank problems. That he can do by playing rook e8 and then rook d8, f6, give up the rook, but at least not get checkmated. And now White would continue by playing rook g8, making sure that when the king captures the pawn on e7, White would grab a couple of pawns along the way. Another option in the starting position here was, which probably is even better, to play rook to d5, attacking the black knight on e5. And now, if rook takes queen, again pawn simply takes back on e7. And for example, after knight c6, which would aim to guard the d8 square, White would continue with knight to d6, knight e7, knight c8, and again Black has the problem of the back rank, that if Black captures either the knight on c8 or the rook on d5, rook e8 would end the game immediately, and that means that now Black needs to give up his knight by opening a little window, solving the back rank problem, and then simply knight takes knight, giving White a clearly superior position, and this would have been the number one choice White should have picked. So let's go back to the position and see what happened in the game. Madness retreated the queen to g5 and settled for a little better endgame, instead of a much better endgame, as we saw with rook d5. Now, black needs to make a decision to trade or not to trade. Well, from black's perspective, first of all, they don't have much of a choice, because if the black queen would try to move away while still protecting the knight on e5, white could, for example, play knight f6, winning material immediately. Also, typically, when you're under pressure, you're under attack, you're dying to trade queens. So naturally, Bobby Fischer gladly agreed to the exchange of queens. And played f6, which is certainly a good choice, because on one hand it protects the knight on e5, not allowing the white rook to enter anywhere along the e5 like on e7. It kind of attacks the knight on g5 and opens a window for the black king, so black no longer needs to worry about any kind of back rank issues. Knight retreated to e4, and Fischer played knight to g6. And now white played rook to c1, trying to gain control of the open file. A tricky moment where at first rook e8 may look tempting, trying to kind of put pressure on the white knight or create a pin in certain cases. The problem is, as so often, you have to be careful when a pin may turn over to become a discovery, which would be the scenario here, after white would play knight takes f6. Black instead, in this case, should trade the pair of rooks, which Fischer did. And now black again needs to be extremely careful, because the white rook is about to come in to c7. An important move, b6, to take away the c5 square from white's knight. For example, had black chosen to play king f7, the white rook would come to c7, and now if king e6, there would be an immediate fork by knight c5 check. Therefore, b6 was a much better choice. Came rook c7 anyway, and now knight f8. King c2, and of course, as we know in endgames, it's extremely important to activate our kings and bring it towards the center. Came king c3, king e6. White is still trying to push for a win in hopes for his advanced pass pawn on d6. Of course, this is always a tricky scenario, because those far advanced pawns, while they can be a great danger to the opponent, they also all of a sudden can become a weakness, because they are so far away from the other pawns or pieces. Black responded by knight g6. Came king to d4 and h6. A preventive move, because if black would have played f5 immediately, white had an opportunity to give knight g5 check and win the pawn on h7. Came rook e8, king f7, and rook back to c8. White is already ready to settle for a draw. But at this point, black is the one who refused to repeat moves and went forward. Played knight f4, attacking the pawn on h3, pawn advanced, and came g6. If black immediately would have played f5 in this position, white has the opportunity to either play king e5 right away, or even just move the knight away, as after rook d6, king e5 would fork the black rook and knight. G6 came, and here came rook h8, going after black's pawn on h6, and also with the idea to check with rook h7 and then in some cases trade rooks and grab the f6 pawn. And here black finally got to play f5, attacking the white knight, which has the job of guarding the pawn on d6. And in this moment, white made the crucial mistake by going for the exchange of rooks. This was the last opportunity for white to save the game. White should have played knight to c3, when, as we know, rook takes pawn is not a good idea because the king would fork all of a sudden the rook and the knight. And if black instead plays king e6, then white could respond with king e3, king e5, check, knight e6, f4 check, and after king d6, white could save the game by perpetual checks, as the black king needs to hang on to the knight and cannot make real progress. Let's go back some moves, and as we said, white should have played knight to c3, and then white would have excellent chances to save the game. Instead, white went for trading the rooks, which was an error in this case, because the white rook is rather active, and typically it's not a good idea to trade a more active piece for a less active piece unless you gain some material on the deal. Came king e6, rooks got traded, and came knight c3. And now black finally won a pawn, even though temporarily white is winning a pawn back, but very temporarily, because black now has the opportunity to immediately go after white's lonely h4 pawn. White continued with king e5, and knight takes h4. Now black has an extra pawn. Came king f4, g5. And here white's best practical chance was to play actively and move the king to e5. Instead, white retreated the king, and now black has a winning position. Knight returned to g6, came a4, and black started advancing his passed pawns. Came f4, king g2, and g4. Knight b5, knight e5. Knight c3, king e6. So the black king is coming to aid the black pawns, while the black knight will take the job of holding off white's potential passed pawn. Knight c6, f3. White is trying to trade off some pawns, but black makes sure keeps them connected. b5, knight e5, f takes, h takes, king f2, knight e3, king g2, knight c5, king f1, king f5, king g2, king e5, king f2, came knight d3, king e2, and finally black can advance the pawn. If king takes knight, g pawn advances, and knight e2, f pawn advances, and white would be lost. After king f3 came knight e1, king e2, g2, king f2, and after f3, white finally resigned. What an endgame! While white was pretty much winning in the beginning, then white could still maintain a draw. White managed to misplay the endgame by not finding the right choices along the way. And finally, let's see the jewel of the week. In this position, even though there is material balance, white having an extra rook versus black's bishop and 2 pawns, it's quite clear that white is suffering, having the rook in the corner, locked in by the black bishop and pawn on h2. Yet, despite this difficult situation, white has a way to save the game. It's quite creative and brilliant. I suggest you try to figure out yourself what is the correct solution. Amazingly, the best solution here is to move the king to a6. If now black would choose to advance the d-pawn, the pawns would get promoted. In fact, white's pawn would get promoted first. And then after black's pawns promote, white would simply simplify the position by giving a check, and then giving up the rook for the pawn, and then capturing black's last pawn, guaranteeing a draw for white. But what happens if after king a6, black advances the g-pawn, with the idea that after b5 and g4, b6 and g3, b7 and g2, the white rook is trapped, and when pawn advances, black promotes the pawn by capturing white's rook. Now indeed, black not only has an extra bishop, but 2 extra pawns, and one of them is a potential queen. Amazingly, white can force a draw here immediately by playing queen g8 check, and regardless where the black king goes, amazingly trapping the black queen in the corner. But what do I mean by trapping? The queen can capture the queen. Oh yes, and that results in stalemate. Well, I hope you enjoyed this real cute final position and got some ideas when to trade and when not to trade. Thank you for listening, and be back next week for some more chess goodies. So long until next week.